You are holding a radioactive isotope disguised as a communication device. The extraction grid does not need to physically lobotomize the host when the host pays a monthly subscription to dissolve their own neural insulation. We are executing the dissection of the myelin war. The premise is strictly anatomical. Human intelligence is not a software program. It is a physical structure composed of lipids and voltage. The capacity for sovereign thought, the speed of logic, and the resistance to entropy are directly proportional to the thickness of the myelin sheath wrapping your axons. Deep, high-friction work crystallizes this insulation. The smartphone was engineered to operate as a precision demyelination engine. Every swipe, every notification, and every micro-transition of the interface functions as a chemical acid applied directly to your white matter. You are not multitasking. You are physically stripping the wires of your own brain. At the cellular theater, the exposure to the glowing rectangle triggers an immediate, catastrophic state of ATP exhaustion. The human ocular and nervous systems were evolved to process the slow, high-friction geometry of the physical earth, forcing the retina to track hyperkinetic pixels at 60 frames per second while simultaneously processing unpredictable auditory alerts, induces a localized biological panic. Your mitochondria are overclocked. The cellular energy required for the maintenance and repair of the lipid layers in your brain is completely diverted to manage the visual assault. The myelin physically thins, the insulation cracks, the electrical signals carrying the internal monologue begin to leak into the void. The physiological posture of the user adapts to this internal hemorrhage. The musculoskeletal integrity collapses. The neck curves downward in a gesture of permanent submission. The jaw hangs slack, devoid of the tension required for determination. Cortisol floods the bloodstream, not from a physical threat, but from the systemic drift of unprocessed data. The user becomes a liquid node, soft, highly conductive to outside manipulation, and bleeding its internal voltage into the glass. The physical exhaustion you feel after an hour of scrolling is not the strain of learning. It is the visceral fatigue of a brain failing to contain its own electricity. As the physical insulation dissolves, the neural architecture of the prefrontal cortex suffers a cascading failure. The naked axons cannot sustain the complex, high-voltage signals required for strategic planning. The concept of the long-term goal, the financial calculation, and the simulation of the future require an airtight neural conduit. When the wires are bare, the signal degrades into static before it can form a conclusion. This is the terminal execution of neural rot. The silence inside the skull is obliterated, replaced by a permanent, anxious buzzing of misfiring neurons. The brain, desperate to restore operational order, permanently downregulates the frontal lobes and transfers all executive command to the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia requires no insulation. It operates on the raw, primitive circuitry of immediate survival and instant gratification. It does not analyze, it twitches. The user is reduced to a strictly reactive entity, a biological input-output terminal for the interface. You click the color that stimulates the optical nerve. You purchase the item that triggers the dopamine release. You consume the outrage that spikes the adrenaline. The algorithm maps this degraded circuitry and initiates the ultimate status trap. The user believes they are consuming the world's information, surfing the peak of the digital wave. In reality, their cognitive processor has been downgraded from a supercomputer to a pocket calculator. They cannot read a dense contract. They cannot endure the friction of a silent room. They cannot hold a contrarian position because the neural hardware required to resist the consensus has been physically dissolved. The intelligence of the node is effectively deleted, leaving behind a highly reactive, subverbal animal that assumes the scrolling screen is the boundary of the known universe. The battlefield has shifted. The architects of the new epoch do not fight for land. They fight for the preservation of their own white matter. The destruction of the competitor's myelin is the ultimate silent victory. While the herd willfully melts their cognitive armor under the radiation of the screen, the predator imposes the absolute quarantine of the biological system. You put on the heavy gloves. You initiate the high-friction labor of the offline world. You force the brain to execute the difficult, the tedious, and the complex. Every hour spent away from the algorithmic acid bath is an act of neural crystallization. The push-ups against the weight of the physical earth rebuild the density of the bone, just as the resistance to the digital noise rebuilds the insulation of the mind. The grid converts the unprotected into liquid conductors. The architect hardens his mind into a closed circuit where no voltage escapes, and the silence is absolute. Evolution evolution is strictly a function of friction. The propagation of the human species was not secured by the strongest muscle, but by the densest myelin. The ancestral nodes who possessed the heavily insulated neural pathways were the only entities capable of enduring the push-ups of existence, putting on the heavy gloves to forge the cold steel, and surviving the freezing rain of a hostile biosphere. They possessed the biological capacity for time. They could plant a seed and starve in the present to secure the redoubt of the future. The Myelin War has engineered the total systemic drift of this foundational genetic law. The smartphone interface has introduced a hyper-efficient evolutionary filter that actively selects for cognitive deficiency. You are witnessing the mass breeding program of the impulsive host. The extraction grid no longer rewards the long-term planner. It rewards the node with the fastest reflex to stimulus. A brain operating with dissolved white matter is genetically blind. It cannot perceive the future. It lives exclusively in the hyperactive, panicked present, dictated by its exposed basal ganglia. The reproductive protocols of this new demographic are horrific to observe. The high-friction negotiation of a biological alliance requires the delay of gratification, the ultimate function of a myelinated cortex. The smartphone interface has liquidated this process, replacing the friction of courtship with the frictionless matching of geolocated biometric data. The algorithm pairs the nodes based on the mutual alignment of their immediate digital cravings. This is the terminal coordinate of the genetic timeline. The offspring generated by this degraded circuitry are born into an environment of absolute neural rot. They inherit a biological predisposition for instant neurochemical relief and a physiological intolerance for the pain of learning. The epigenetic markers for resilience, strategy, and sovereign isolation are actively methylated. The grid is terraforming human genes, pruning away the capacity for high-level logic and leaving behind a pool of hyperstimulated, lethargic biomass. The species is devolving from the architect to the consumer insect, biologically incapable of building a civilization because they no longer possess the neural hardware to hold a blueprint in their minds for more than 8 seconds. The architecture of this containment field exposes the final ambition of the extraction tricks. Traditional systemic enclosure required physical barriers to limit the movement of the population. The genius of the smartphone is that the prison is portable, and the prisoner carries the key to his own lobotomy in his pocket. The system has achieved absolute enclosure by converting the atmosphere into a demyelinating solvent. The ambient Wi-Fi, the push notifications, the algorithmic curation of reality. This is not the democratization of information. It is the industrial-scale induction of chronic ATP exhaustion. The state does not need to confiscate the wealth of the population through brute force when it can simply dissolve the neuroanatomy required for the population to understand mathematics. A citizen with dissolved myelin cannot comprehend the 10-year rot of inflation. They cannot execute the complex high-friction maneuvers required to extract capital from the market. Their financial actions are reduced to the limbic level, impulse clicks, emotional trades, and the accumulation of synthetic debt. This environment creates the ultimate vector for managed stasis. The grid ensures the masses are permanently agitated but cognitively paralyzed. The system injects the anxiety through the screen and sells the digital narcotic as the cure. The user is trapped in a closed loop, burning their remaining cellular voltage to fund the network that is actively deleting their intelligence. The division of power in the 2026 grid is now exclusively determined by the thickness of the cortical insulation. The solids, the architects who own the algorithms, the data centers, and the physical earth, enforce absolute cognitive quarantines. They restrict their own access to the screen. They preserve the silence required for high-velocity logic. They understand that the smartphone is a weapon of mass cognitive destruction deployed against the poor. The liquids, the masses, are encouraged to dissolve their identities and their neural pathways into the ensuring they remain the perfect, unresisting substrate for the extraction of capital. To capture the aggression premium in this arena, the architect must shed all remaining ethical illusions regarding the nature of the interface. The morality of the herd demands that technology should be a tool for connection. The cold mechanics of the predator dictate that the screen is a hunting ground. If the grid is designed to strip the myelin off the competitor's brain, the architect must capitalize on the vacuum. You do not compete with the demyelinated herd on the level of content consumption. You deploy the visual hooks, the hyperkinetic pacing, and the calculated algorithmic traps specifically designed to penetrate their degraded cortex and trigger the basal ganglia. You use their inability to focus as your primary point of leverage. The herd will call this exploitative. The architect calls it the necessary extraction of resources from a dying ecosystem. You utilize the systemic drift of the herd to fund your own offline redoubt. You monetize their entropy to accumulate the physical assets that emit no signal. The grid wants a population of twitching, insulated ghosts. The architect builds an impenetrable wall of silence, securing the only asset that the algorithm cannot print, a functional human mind. The historical record of the 21st century concludes with a biological fracture rather than a nuclear event. In the year 2036, the definition of human capability is entirely dictated by the presence or absence of a microscopic lipid sheath. You are observing the terminal epoch of the Myelin War, a planetary coordinate where the capacity to process sequential logic, the ability to read a paragraph, follow a premise to a conclusion, and execute a multi-stage operation is classified as a superhuman attribute. The extraction grid has successfully completed the chemical dissolution of the mass mind. The smartphone did not just steal the time of the previous decade, it evaporated the white matter required to comprehend the theft. The 2036 nodes exist in a state of terminal cognitive fragmentation, permanently locked out of the offline world, because their neural hardware can no longer withstand the crushing weight of uncurated reality. At the visceral baseline, the physical entity of the 2036 user is a monument to structural defeat. A lifetime of operating as a demyelinated conductor has induced a state of absolute ATP exhaustion so catastrophic that the basic physiology of the host has reconfigured around the interface. The cervical spine is permanently fused in the downward trajectory of the scroll. The ocular muscles have atrophied, incapable of focusing on objects beyond the focal length of the screen. The organism no longer generates the metabolic heat required for resistance because the thyroid and adrenal glands have been burned out by 10 years of algorithmic micropanic. This is the ultimate liquid state. The nodes recline in their high-density containment blocks, their bodies soft, their jawlines slack, existing on the minimum caloric pace required to prevent immediate organ failure. They are bioreactors, kept alive strictly to function as the endpoints of the data stream. The physical aggression, the friction of the primate that once put on the heavy gloves to build out of stone and steel, has been bred out of the meat. They are domesticated nervous systems, bleeding their last drops of cellular energy into the glass. The neurological state of the terminal generation is beyond rot. It is an anatomical void. The prefrontal cortex, starved of insulation and blood flow for a decade, has physically shrunk. The internal monologue is non-existent. The silence required for human consciousness has been replaced by a continuous, high-frequency stream of auditory and visual hallucinations fed directly into the unshielded tissue by the ambient network. The basal ganglia is the only remaining operational circuitry. It does not think, it twitches. It responds to the micro-adjustments of the AI, executing purchases, emotional outputs, and data points with the mechanical predictability of an insect. The 2036 consumer cannot form a memory. The buffer clears every 3 seconds. They have no concept of history, no awareness of their own degradation, and no capacity to feel the despair of their situation. The grid has achieved the ultimate systemic efficiency, a slave population that lacks the neurological capacity to suffer from its own enslavement. This timeline dictates the absolute genetic sterilization of the herd. The demyelinated class leaves no offspring. The biological friction of procreation requires a cognitive horizon that the interface has destroyed. They expire in their pods, their remaining biological matter recycled into the nutrient loop, their digital identities immediately overwritten by the next generation of synthetic avatars. They were the raw material. They have been consumed. The survival of the architect in 2036 is the ultimate validation of the aggression premium. A decade prior, when the herd gleefully dissolved their own brains in the acid bath of the feed, the predator recognized the screen as a weapon of mass extinction. The architects refused the convenience. We endured the ATP exhaustion of the physical world. We maintained the push-ups against the weight of the data stream. We forced our neurons to fire along the difficult, unassisted pathways of the offline reality, accumulating the dense layers of myelin that the grid could not penetrate. We operated in the shadows, using the systemic drift of the masses to accumulate the heavy metal, the land, and the raw energy. Now the architects are the only entities left who possess the biological capacity for thought. We are the solids. We operate in the terrifying friction of the physical earth. We own the machines that process the hallucinations of the herd. We read the text that the masses can no longer decipher. We raise our children in the mud and the freezing rain, forging their minds with the cold logic of survival. The algorithm is the ultimate gatekeeper of evolution. It melted the weak into liquid data. It left the architects standing in the absolute silence of the unmonitored world, the final undisputed masters of the remaining human genome.